Hello, I'm Hudson Foga. This is number 0820 of the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder, and it comes to you right now.
The following program is brought to you in living color.
Now, it's time for an eclectic mix of interviews and some of the oddest news stories you'll ever hear. It's the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder.
Hey there, hi there, ho there! Peter Anthony Holder here with you, and yes, this is indeed another edition of the Stuff File program, number 0820. And coming up on this edition of the Stuff File program, you'll meet Steve Williams, who is the author of Notorious: Leadership Lessons from History's Most Notorious Leaders. In the first iteration of the book, Steve had to change one word in the title.
It was ruthless leaders. A market study said that people got the wrong impression with the word ruthless. They said, well, do I have to become a ruthless leader to be any good? And that wasn't what I wanted the takeaway to be, so we changed it to just notorious. The book contains 20 lessons, 10 different characters throughout history, and it all focuses on these were bad people for the most part, but they were extremely successful, and the things that made them successful still apply to today in pretty much any business environment.
Jordyn is the author of The Culling of the Grull. What's the story about, and how did it come about?
It was a writer's group that threw out a challenge, write an 800-word story about snow. I wrote this story about these ancient people who had never seen snow, but were forced to look for a new homeland, and they came across snow and didn't know what it was. But they did notice that if they picked it up, it was cold and it turned into water. So they assumed it was something sacred. That was how I started, with this short story, and then someone said, well, you should continue, write more.
Andrew Forbes is the author of Fieldwork: On Baseball and Making a Living. It's a book about the jobs that early baseball players also had during their playing career off the diamond as well.
I have two previous collections of writing about baseball, and I figured I was done. But two things came together. Years ago, a friend gave me a postcard. It was about baseball players who had curious second jobs. Ted Wilkes worked in a power plant. Richie Hebner dug graves. And that put into my head this idea of baseball players not solely existing by means of playing baseball. And then, quite incidentally, reading a biography of a pitcher from the 1920s named Urban Shocker, there was mention of this other baseball player, this pitcher named Hub Pruitt, who basically used the game to finance his education.
And there's lots and lots of Stuff File news, dad joke theater, morning shower thoughts, and of course, an idiot of the day. The guest later, the person who told you this was show number 0820, was Hudson Foga, a former colleague, a writer, translator, and broadcaster as well. Thank you very much, Hudson, for doing the guest slate on this edition of the Stuff File program, a show that is listener-supported, fan-funded radio that depends on you for our success. Join us at patreon.com to help make this show an even bigger and better radio experience. Well, let's get right to the stuff. Here on the Stuff File program, we often make light of stories in the news, but this first story is somewhat disturbing. 24-year-old Kyle Langford is running for governor of California as a Republican, and he has an idea for handling undocumented immigrants. He said, "It is an initiative that will encourage family formation in the state of California. Fostering healthy, stable young families is my number one priority." The initiative? Deport all males without legal status, but give women a year to do something specific. Now, I actually have the audio for this, which I will play for you because if I just read it, you probably wouldn't believe it. He was talking on The Lily Show with host Lily Gaddis, and he said this.
We know who you are. We know where you are. If you marry one of our Californian incels, then you can stay. But if you don't, then, well, you're getting sent back across.
Yikes. Just simply yikes. And he's only 24 years old. You know, The Handmaid's Tale went on the air in 2017, which means he was about 16 at the time. He's probably someone who thinks that show was either a documentary or some sort of visual owner's manual. Again, yikes. A group of teenagers is accused of attacking an Easter bunny at a mall in Naples, Florida. The bunny was attacked on the way to the break room at Coastland Center Mall. Naples Police Department PIO Lieutenant Brian McGinn said they were following the bunny back to the staging area, tugging, pushing, pulling, and trying to pull the costume apart. 2 13-year-old boys were arrested for battery. A 14-year-old boy was cited. Authorities say the person who was wearing the bunny costume was not seriously hurt. Geez, if these delinquents can do that to the Easter bunny, just imagine what they might do to Santa. I mean, he's an old guy with a loot bag.
Greetings, passengers, to another Stuff File program installment of Idiots in Flight. This is the pre-boarding announcement. We are now inviting those passengers who are complete half-wits to begin boarding at this time. Thank you.
We have 2 stories to share with you here. A passenger sparked an emergency landing after convincing himself snakes were slithering on an EasyJet flight from Gatwick. The crazed hallucinations stemmed from a snake pattern on his own clothes. He was wearing a t-shirt with a snake pattern on it and suddenly feared the reptiles were slithering around the cabin. Families looked on in horror as the passenger became abusive and threatening and repeatedly screamed, "Snakes on a plane! We need to land!" The flight from Gatwick Airport to Marrakesh in Morocco made an emergency landing in Faro in Portugal on April 19th. Cops came aboard and escorted the snake-fearing passenger off the Airbus A320 with around 180 passengers and crew aboard. The harrowing events brought back terrifying memories of the 2006 cult movie Snakes on a Plane starring Samuel L. Jackson. A source said it sounds funny to hear a passenger screaming "snakes on a plane," but it was incredibly scary for the families on the EasyJet flight. No one quite knew what was going on, or initially if the flyer had actually seen a snake loose among the cabin at 30,000 feet. To no one's surprise, it's thought the passenger had consumed large quantities of drink and/or drugs before takeoff. Bottom line, make sure you wear something comfortable and soothing when you take to the skies.
Stuff File program Idiots in Flight. Story 2.
And a recent Southwest Airlines flight was met by law enforcement after landing in Chicago, where police removed a passenger who had stripped naked and defecated on her seat. You know, the only question I have was whether she had an aisle seat or a window seat. The plane was taken out of service to be cleaned. Southwest, just the latest airline to be put in an unenviable position of apologizing for the bizarre behavior of an unruly passenger, issued a statement. Nothing is more important to Southwest than the safety of our customers and employees, and we appreciate the professionalism of our flight crew. I'm kind of wondering what the thought process is to getting naked before defecating. Also, there's no amount of complimentary snacks to satisfy the passengers around her.
Here's a warning to some passengers. The air marshals are getting creative. For most of the flight, you might have zip-tied limbs and you may be duct-taped in an overhead bin until your diverted destination. But the Stuff File program appreciates you. Thank you.
Anyway, let's get to our first guest here in this edition of the Stuff File program, shall we? The long-held conventional belief in the business world is that leadership can only be learned from positive role models. However, Steve Williams claims that we have it backward. He says we can learn a lot about effective leadership from the likes of Attila the Hun, Al Capone, and Genghis Khan. Steve is a certified leadership coach and the author of several books, including Notorious: Leadership Lessons from History's Most Notorious Leaders. He joins us via Zoom from Wisconsin. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for being on the program with us. So, what are you saying about some of these people like I just mentioned, Attila the Hun, Al Capone, and Genghis Khan? Are you saying that they have good tips, or are they good examples for what not to do in business, or both?
Actually, it's the first. The first iteration of the book, this is the second pass, it was ruthless leaders. And a market study said that people got the wrong impression with the word ruthless. They said, well, do I have to become a ruthless leader to be any good? And that wasn't what I wanted the takeaway to be. So we changed it to just notorious. And the book contains 20 lessons, 10 different characters throughout history. And it all focuses on, yeah, these were bad people for the most part, but they were extremely successful, and the things that made them successful still apply to today in pretty much any business environment.
Okay, so one of the most modern equivalents that I just brought up would be Al Capone, because it's the 20th century, and he did kind of run his business like a business. So is that the closest to what we're talking about here, or can you take some experiences from, as I said, Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan?
You could take lessons from every single one of them. I mean, everyone is a little bit different. There's 2 lessons in the book from each of the 10 leaders, and none of the lessons kind of overlap. You know, from Al Capone, we talk about understanding what your customer wants and how to organize and streamline your business. People like Sonny Barger, who ran the Hells Angels for 50 years, he was really interesting because the lessons from him are create an environment of empowerment and encourage critical thinking. So, you know, a guy that's running some of the toughest people in the world is giving them a voice at the table on club decisions and things. So every leader has a different take on leadership skills that made them successful, but they're all different. And I think that's what makes it very unique. I mean, there's a ton of books out there by, you know, positive role models like, you know, John Maxwell or Jack Welch or some of the other ones, but there's not a lot of books out there taking it from the dark side, right? The people that you really normally don't find in the business section of the library or your bookstore.
Are you saying, though, that, or are you worried about the fact that you might be glorifying some of these people?
Well, there is that risk, but I start the book out, and I think I end the book with kind of a challenge saying that, you know, the true student of leadership won't care as much about where the lesson came from as to what they can learn and how they can apply it in their current career. And even though most of the people in this book did a lot of bad things, one really interesting thing, Peter, that I learned was the common thread that kind of tied them all together was that their first preference was to resolve things peacefully. And they only resorted to violence when peace didn't work. So you think about people like Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun being, you know, very vicious and violent and ruthless, but they first tried to resolve conflicts. Of course, they were trying to take people over, but they tried to do it peacefully. And when that didn't work, then they, you know, turned into the people that you commonly think about when you hear their names. So I found that really interesting that first they wanted to do it peacefully without anybody getting hurt and without them losing any people. And when that didn't work, then they turned to, you know, the ruthless ways that they got things done. But aside from that, how they got things done are the lessons, right? What made them able to command the largest army in the world? What made them successful in running Russia, in the case of Catherine the Great? So there's so many different lessons, and depending on, they're all valuable, but there's a lesson on just about every aspect of leadership from one of these 10 people in here.
You mentioned there are 10, and I'm just wondering if any of the others are of a modern era. And again, I'm going to bring up Al Capone because when I say Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, they are barbaric people in a barbaric time. They were almost normal for their times. But Al Capone was definitely a criminal in a more modern time. Are there other examples of that in your book?
People ask me a lot, which are my favorite characters? And I said, that's like asking me which of my kids I love the most, right? But I tell them the two that I think I can resonate with the most are Sonny Barger of the Hells Angels and Steve Jobs, because they lived in my time. I could relate to them, right? They were alive when I was growing up and I was starting in my leadership journey. So I could see firsthand, things. It wasn't as distant as somebody like Sun Tzu who lived 2,500 years ago, right? I knew about Steve Jobs. I'm an Apple fan. So, some of the things that these people did to become successful, I could see in real time happening. So those two plus, Al Capone was a little bit before my time, but he was more current than some of the other ones. I tried to cover that 2,500 year period and space them out so that I had somebody throughout each critical time period in history. And Sonny and Steve, like I said, they lived in my timeline and I could relate to them. I had to learn about the other ones.
But you wouldn't be necessarily saying that Steve Jobs is notorious, would you?
Well, I get asked that question also. I said, why is Steve Jobs in this book? I mean, if I wrote a book on the most positive role models in leadership, Steve Jobs would be in that book also. If you do any research on Steve Jobs, you know that there was a good Steve and a bad Steve. He was such a visionary leader, but he was brutal with his people. And that's where the notorious comes in. I mean, the hours he made him work, the striving for simplicity, and they used to say, I got whacked by Steve's simple stick. And it was just going back and having to refine and refine, and nothing was ever good enough the first 3 or 4 passes for Steve. So that's kind of where he falls into this thing is, how he treated his people. I mean, a lot of the people at Apple became millionaires, but Steve, I met Steve Wozniak, who co-founded Apple with Steve Jobs, and he said, yeah, he was my best friend, but he was also, in some cases, my worst enemy because he was so hard to work with. That's why Steve Jobs is included in his book.
Some of the people who go back in time, they were successful due to wars in some cases.
Yes.
I noticed that in the 20th century, when you brought up Al Capone and Steve Jobs, you didn't bring up wars. That's kind of like the third rail in some cases. People often joke about, well, Mussolini made the trains run on time. And of course, you cannot talk about the Darth Vader of World War II, which I won't. Were you ever thinking of bringing those guys up?
It's funny. I didn't intentionally try to focus X amount of people that were from a military background and X amount that weren't. I tried to find people that had positive leadership qualities that would translate to today's environment. And I tried to get a combination of men and women. I tried to get a combination, throughout these various time periods, and also lessons that didn't overlap with each other. It's funny you mentioned Mussolini. I had another person tell me, hey, on your next edition, you should talk about how Mussolini made the trains run on time. So it's funny that you would mention that because I've heard that before. So I've got military people in there. I've got, Freitas, Eric's daughter, was a Viking. She was the illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red. I've got Blackbeard the pirate, Catherine the Great. She was the Empress of Russia, Napoleon Bonaparte. So it kind of, he was in war. Catherine the Great certainly lived through some wars, but the lessons are focusing on business aspects and leadership aspects. So it's not all necessarily based on warfare, but certainly, the first half of them were basically kind of, the world was a different place then, right? So it kind of evolved as we evolved.
Well, because the world was a different place at the time, I'm assuming that you believe that all of these qualities that they may have had, even though they were notorious people, are transferable to our modern time.
They absolutely are. They absolutely are. I mean, if you talk about some of the takeaways like shatter the status quo, lead from the front, let's see, know what your customers want, keep it simple, be a heretic, encourage critical thinking. All those things could come out of a book that was written by Jack Welch, talking about Fortune 500 companies and how they did things at GE. These are all skills. One of the things that I mentioned in the book is I don't believe that great leaders have to be born. I mean, I think, great leadership can be a teachable skill set. And every one of these lessons, I believe, you can apply whether you're a mom and pop shop or a mid-sized company or a Fortune 500 company. This list of lessons would apply to any one of those conditions today, just as much as it did in the time period throughout the book.
Well, it's a great concept. The book is called Notorious: Leadership Lessons from History's Most Notorious Leaders. Steve, I thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on the program with us.
Peter, I really appreciate the opportunity, and good luck with the show. I love it.
Steve Williams, author of Notorious: Leadership Lessons from History's Most Notorious Leaders. You can go to our website at thestuffile.com to the page for this show, which is show number 0820, and you'll find the links to Steve's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his book directly. You're listening to the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder.
And now, Dad Joke Theater.
What's an astronaut's favorite part of a computer? The space bar.
Join us again for another Stuff File program, Dad Joke Theater.
There's still more guests, more news, and an idiot of the day coming your way on the Stuff File program. Stay tuned. The Stuff File program is a listener-supported, fan-funded radio show that depends on you for our success. Join us at patreon.com to help make this show an even bigger and better radio experience. Sign up and find out about our rewards program. Being a patron doesn't have to be a long-term commitment. There's absolutely no obligation. You could join today and end whenever you'd like. But the time we have your support would be so greatly appreciated. We'd also love to hear your thoughts about the show and even your ideas for rewards. Join us for the ride. Join us at patreon.com/thestuffileprogram.
I'm standing tall for Canada. Hello, bonjour, this is Andy Kim. I am honored to be part of this beautiful country where people often find the impossible possible. We stand together and fight for each other, supporting Canadian businesses, buying Canadian products, protecting Canadian jobs. Shop as if your country depends on it. Keep your money in Canada for Canada.
This is your safe haven from the hard news of the day. The Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. It's radio for your happy place.
Still to come on the program, we'll talk to the author of The Calling of the Grull. Plus, we will talk about field work on baseball and making a living, about some of the jobs that baseball players were forced to work at even during their playing days back in the day. We also have a morning shower thought coming your way, and of course an idiot of the day, and much more in Stuff File News right here, right now. A burnt hen discovered in Rostock, Germany led to 5 hours of police investigation. There was a forensic team, there were floodlights and a 3D scanner, there was a drone, and they called upon an undertaker to take care of the woman who had been found unalive, unclothed, and charred. But then all police measures were immediately terminated, authorities said. The undertaker could fortunately be canceled. The police would like to take this opportunity to ask people to dispose of their rubbish in the appropriate locations. Rubbish? Yes. The body had never been alive. It was, a recreational mannequin. This is happening more and more as erotic toys get more realistic. Police were alerted to complete or partial synthetic bodies in 2 other German towns in recent weeks. 6 years ago, saving a doll from the river Elbe took the work of 30 people. That doll, too, had been thought to be a corpse. Yeah, well, wait till the dolls start walking and talking. Yeah. And a Florida woman is facing felony charges after allegedly robbing a Dairy Queen at gunpoint for just $1.50. The incident took place in Coconut Creek, where 44-year-old Allison Fetting reportedly pulled out a black gun and demanded money from the cashier. However, instead of taking cash from the register, she grabbed a tip jar containing $1.50 and fled the scene. No one was hurt during the robbery. Fetting was taken into custody the next day on a second-degree petty theft charge. Although the robbery occurred last year, Fetting was not booked into jail until last Friday. What? Were they waiting to see where she would spend the loot? She had previously been sentenced to prison for another robbery in 2003 in Osceola County. Fetting has also been accused of similar crimes in Coconut Creek. Fetting is currently held at the Paul Rain Detention Facility pending her arraignment. You know, I think she needs higher goals in life.
At Dairy Queen. We treat you right.
Yeah, but your customers, not so much. An NYPD housing officer was arrested on a charge of official misconduct after allegedly stopping a motorist in Queens while on duty and asking to borrow $1,700, money he never repaid.
You know why I pulled you over? Depends on how long you were following me.
29-year-old Officer Armando Silvestri was assigned to monitor security cameras in northern Brooklyn. Police said Silvestri stopped a driver on March the 1st while in uniform in Queens and asked where he could borrow money. The motorist lent him $1,700 in exchange for a promised fee, but Silvestri never paid the money back. The NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau launched the investigation, which led to Silvestri being charged with 3 counts of official misconduct. Is it just me, or is the person who lent him the money just as suspicious as the housing officer who asked for it? And finally, in this section of Stuff File News, before we get to our next guest here in this edition of the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder, they say you shouldn't let coming into money change you, right? Well, on April 28th, 50-year-old James Farthing of Kentucky was presented with an oversized check for winning the $167.3 million Powerball jackpot. The next day, Farthing was arrested on felony and misdemeanor charges after an incident at the Trade Winds Resort in St. Pete Beach, Florida. That included kicking a sheriff's deputy in the face and attempting to flee. Farthing, an ex-con whose record includes convictions for theft, drug trafficking, and engaging in an organized criminal syndicate, got into a drunken argument with a male patron at the resort and punched that man in the face, then assaulted the deputy as he attempted to break up the fight. The police report said Farthing appeared very intoxicated and was yelling, screaming, and making incoherent statements. The newly minted millionaire's bond was set at only $10,000, but he remains behind bars on felony and misdemeanor charges for violating his parole. Somehow, I don't think his millions will last a very long time. I mean, what he doesn't squander will probably go to lawsuit fees from all the people who will eventually sue him over his bad behavior.
Your life could be exciting enough. If not, play Powerball.
And let's get to our next guest here in this edition of the Stuff All program, shall we? Jonni Jordyn is the author of The Calling of the Gruul. The Gruul are an ancient clan of people that lived 10,000 years ago. They must find a new homeland when their village is destroyed by a flood. Jonni joins us via Zoom from Denver, Colorado. Hi, Jonni.
Hi.
Thanks for being on the program with us. How did you lock in on this particular story and why?
This story has a unique beginning because it was a writers group that threw out a challenge, write an 800-word story about snow. So I wrote this story about these ancient people who had never seen snow, but were forced to look for a new homeland, and they came across snow and didn't know what it was. But they did notice that if they picked it up, it was cold and it turned into water. So they assumed it was something sacred. And that was how I started with this short story. And then someone said, well, you should continue, write more. So I had this idea that I would write a full chapter and release it on Amazon every month. Every month I came out with a new chapter, and that has a lot of huge problems and challenges for a writer. But that's how the story came. And after I'd written maybe 30 something chapters, I gathered the first bunch and turned them into a book.
That's an interesting concept, the writing of chapters and putting them online. And I'm just curious to know, did you have an idea while you were writing these chapters where the story was going? And did your story go in different directions because of the reaction you got to the chapters?
Not from reaction to the chapters, but the story did go in directions I didn't anticipate as I was developing the characters. The characters kind of led the way. It was a unique experiment, and I was gaining readers, and it was proving to be successful. And then all of a sudden, one month, it just died. 0 readers. And I suspect that Amazon did something to stop telling my readers that I had a new chapter out.
Wow.
And it wasn't much long later, they came out with their own Vela system that allowed you to put out a new chapter every now and then.
What was it like for you writing to deadline because you had to come up with a new chapter every month?
That was a challenge. And most of my chapters are between 8 and 12,000 words. So I'm not putting out little chapters. And it was not only meeting the deadline was a chapter, but having to be able to write it knowing that I can't go back and change something. I can't, 4 chapters later just say, oh, I'm going to give somebody a special skill all of a sudden in the middle of their life. I can't do that. Whereas when I'm writing a regular book, I can go back and introduce that again in the chapter 2 when I'm working on chapter 6. So yeah, there were challenges for sure.
So what kind of test is that for you as a writer? In other words, how has it changed your writing because you've done this process?
I won't do it again. No, that's not true. When Amazon came out with the Vela system, and I asked them, can I port what I've done into there? And they said no. So I started something new, and I continued it on, and then again Amazon changed the rules, and they said we're going to give the first 5 chapters away for free. And I'm saying it's only going to be 10 or 12 chapters. How can I give half of it away? So unfortunately, what it taught me was to be a little more wary when Amazon comes out with something special.
No, but the reason why I ask, I'm talking about the physical writing, the fact that you were forced to do this chapter by chapter and release them one at a time. And as you say, you couldn't go back and change anything because you already had that chapter out. Has it just changed the structure of what you write, generally speaking, or the process in which you write?
Well, one thing it did do, it forced me into a regimen. I get up at 5 a.m. and I start writing, and well, at the time I would write from about 5 to 8, which is when I would start preparing for my day job. The day job kind of stole some of that time, but still, I get up in the morning and I start writing, and that's That's one thing that it forced me to change. As far as the actual words on the paper, no, I'm just a little more conscious about how everything relates from chapter 1 to chapter 12, and I'm a little more careful in trying to know what my characters are and who they are. But it doesn't always work. They still come up and say, "Hey, you know something? I really like to skydive," and I'm like, "Where did that come from?"
Now, you started writing at an early age, but you went into a business where you were playing music, and you didn't write your first novel until after you kind of retired from that music. What similarities do you have from your days of music making to writing? How do they blend with each other?
First, I'll start with the biggest difference. The biggest difference is when I was playing music, we would be rehearsing late, and I'd routinely be up until 1 a.m. And when we did shows, it would be even up till 3 a.m. And when I started writing, I write better in the morning. So I shifted completely from being a night person to being a morning gal. So that was a huge. Now, as far as the actual mechanics of what I did, playing music, I didn't perform like other musicians do, and I didn't really fully understand this until later. I knew when I was on stage and when I was with the band, I knew that I did not memorize every single note I'm going to play. I memorized how the song went, and then I was kind of like 3 notes ahead playing my parts, and I was very good at that. I didn't know how or why I did it that way. It turns out I learned years later in therapy that I happen to be autistic, and playing the music is just one of my skills, one of my gifts. So when I'm writing, I still have a certain amount of gift as far as being able to think out these plots that are twisted and turning, but I'm not in the position where I'm doing it live. And so there really is there's not a whole lot of similarity between writing down my words and playing the music live.
Well, tell us about the Grull, because the book is called A Calling of the Grull, and as I mentioned in the introduction, they have to find a new homeland when their village is destroyed by a flood. You started off talking about the fact that they've never seen snow. What else do we know about them?
Well, you don't know everything up front. What you do know is they're not cave people. They have huts. They know how to build rudimentary homes. They domesticated chickens and goats. And when the flood came, they lost a lot of their friends. They lost their chickens. They lost their goats, and they had very little left when they started this pilgrimage to find the home of their ancients. Um, Later on, you will learn, and this is pretty common with a lot of societies and a lot of mythologies, that they are one of 12 tribes. But they were the lost tribe because they were in this isolated valley and nobody knew where they were. And as they begin this pilgrimage going up, they become discovered, or they discover other people. And so they discovered a lot more than just snow. But it was a very treacherous climb, and not everybody made it.
Okay, I live in Montreal. You live in Denver. We both know snow. But what's it like writing a story where people don't know about snow or are experiencing it for the first time?
Well, when I wrote this story, snow was still pretty new to me. I come from the West Coast, from the San Francisco Bay, and snow was something that I had to drive 3 to 6 hours to go see. When I came to Denver, that's when I really started writing, and I learned how quickly snow can just pop up. So it was still fresh to me, the whole idea of having to prepare when you know there's going to be some snowfall. You know there's going to be that your roads, my roads where I live, don't get cleaned. And so if we have, say, more than 10 inches of snow, I'm stuck in the house until enough trucks go up and down the road and enough sunshine melts it a bit. So those are all things that I learned along with writing this book.
The book is called The Calling of the Grull. Jonni, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on the program with us.
My pleasure. Always nice to talk to you.
Jonni Jordyn, author of The Calling of the Grull. You can go to our website at thestufffile.com to the page for this show, which is show number 0820, and you'll find the links to Jonni's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order her book directly. You're listening to the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder.
Giving you something to think about. This is Morning Shower Thoughts.
Whoever created the tradition of not seeing the bride in the dress before the wedding saved husbands everywhere from hours of dress shopping.
Morning Shower Thoughts from the Stuff File program.
Got something for the mailbag? Drop Peter a line. He'd love to hear from you. Send your email to mailbag@thestufffile.com. And remember, stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's mailbag@thestufffile.com. Or catch up with him on Twitter or Facebook. There's more Stuff File coming your way in just a few moments.
Michael Liebling is the author of The Serial Killer's Son Takes a Wife. It's a page-turning thriller. You say you've read other serial killer novels? Oh, as Michael will tell you, not like this one.
It's not like any serial killer novel you've read before. It really goes behind the scenes. So when I say he takes a wife, you've got to imagine what it's like to be the offspring of somebody who's murdered multiple people. So how do you live with yourself after that? And you were just a kid when it all happened. If you fall in love, how do you tell the woman you love your dad was a serial killer? And how would she react? So the title, it's not entirely clear, but as you get into it, it will become very clear.
The Serial Killer's Son Takes a Wife. It's a recipe for mystery with a scoop of humor and a sprinkle of horror. The Serial Killer's Son Takes a Wife. Available now at Amazon and wherever you buy books.
Available on Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and just about every other way you stream audio. This is the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. It's radio that's everywhere you want to be, and some places you don't.
And still to come on the program, we will talk to the author of Fieldwork on baseball and making a living. We also have an Idiot of the Day coming your way a little later on, and I've got a few more Stuff File news stories to share with you right here, right now. A Union County, Oregon man was charged with 2 counts of bias crime and several other charges after an incident near the LeGrand Fire Department on a Sunday. LeGrand police were called to a report of a man pointing a gun at men on the cell phone tower near the fire department. Police determined the suspect, 49-year-old Michael Patrick Haynes, was angry they were working on a Sunday, yelling racial slurs and telling them this is America and they don't belong here. A witness also took a photo of Haynes holding a shotgun and staring up at the workers. Police later interviewed the workers who said Haynes was yelling at them and flipping them off, pointing a shotgun at them, and also firing a pepper gun into the air. They said they feared they would be shot if they tried to climb down from the cell phone tower. Police later made contact with Haynes at his home, and he admitted to having the shotgun, but said it was for self-defense. Officers also noted that Haynes was extremely intoxicated when interviewed. Haynes was arraigned the following day on charges of bias crime, disorderly conduct, unlawful use of a weapon, and pointing a firearm at another. Well, it would seem that Haynes has a problem with working on Sundays in the name of the Lord, but apparently gets plastered on Sundays in the name of the Lord. And finally, a Florida man has been labeled as a birthday suit bandit by deputies after they said he tried to break into a woman's home while naked. 63-year-old Matthew Hunter of Palm Coast was arrested on charges of attempted burglary, criminal mischief, and exposure of sex organs. The woman inside the home called 911 after she heard what sounded like a knife trying to cut through the lock on her front door. When deputies arrived, they found Hunter walking away from the woman's house, completely naked as described. They also discovered gouge marks on the doorframe and molding. Hunter is the woman's neighbor. The woman saw Hunter through her front window as he yelled that he was going to come inside the home and demanded that she open the door. Deputies later spoke with Hunter's wife at their home, who said her husband had been drinking heavily and was taking psychiatric medication. She admitted that she was afraid of him but had no idea that he had left their home as she had been asleep. So basically, we are talking about naked sleepwalking with a knife on psychiatric medication while drunk. That pretty much fills up your bingo card, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, let's get to our last guest here in this edition of the Stuff File program, shall we? Andrew Forbes is the author of Fieldwork on Baseball and Making a Living. It's a collection of baseball's rich history that uncovers the people who make the game happen. Andrew joins us via Zoom from Peterborough, Ontario. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Thanks for being on the program with us. What was the impetus in doing this book and doing the deep dive into the people who make the game happen?
Well, a bit of a backstory. I have two previous collections of writing about baseball, and I figured I was done. But two things came together years ago, very briefly. Years ago, a friend gave me a postcard that was done by an artist named Amelie Mancini. She's based in Brooklyn, if I'm not mistaken. It was about baseball players who had curious second jobs. So things like a guy who worked in Ted Wilkes worked in a power plant, and Richie Hebner dug graves, things like this. Just little one sort of a woodcut print on a postcard, and that put into my head this idea of baseball players not solely existing by means of playing baseball. And then, quite incidentally, reading a biography of a pitcher from the 1920s named Urban Shocker, there was mention of this other baseball player, this pitcher named Hubert Pruitt, or Hub Pruitt, who basically used the game to finance his education and a career outside of baseball. And that, to me, seemed interesting because it flipped on its head the understanding I had of the relationship between work and baseball, which is that you dedicate yourself to the game completely. If you're lucky and everything breaks right, you end up becoming a professional baseball player because that's what you want to do for as long as possible. This guy, on the other hand, used baseball merely as a summer job to finance what he really wanted to do. So that led me down the path of investigating the relationship between labor and baseball, between work and play. And one of the great pleasures of writing some of the books that I do is I get to spend a lot of time doing research. So it led to a couple of years of research, just digging into all these fascinating stories and then coming up with some writing based on all of that.
Well, I think part of the situation is the fact that, we now know baseball as being a very lucrative sport for professionals to play, but it was... you only had to go back to the 60s where you understood that baseball wasn't necessarily well paying for anyone but the superstars, and that some people had to do other work besides playing baseball.
That's right. The phenomenon of multi-million-dollar athletes in general, but baseball players in particular, doesn't go back that far. We're talking about true free agency really only arriving in the late 1970s. And before that, there's always exceptions, your Babe Ruths of the world, but for the most part, it is not a high-paying, very lucrative position. And so, yeah, as you say, you need to find other income streams. And it makes me think of you and I spoke briefly about football before we came on the air here, and it makes me think about the stories of Canadian Football League players who were teachers in the off season or who sold cars and things like that. And I think that's been true much more recently in Canadian football, as an example. But in baseball, it's long been the norm that unless you are a very, very select sort of skill level and fame level, you really are working kind of hand to mouth, and you need other jobs in the off season, and that was fascinating to me.
So tell us some of the stories that we would find in Fieldwork.
It is a collection of sort of directed and linked essays. So there's a lot of different stuff in there. I talk about Curt Flood, who was a ball player for the St. Louis Cardinals in the 60s, who ended up basically sacrificing his career to advance the cause of players' labor rights. I talk about the great Albert Pujols, who played for the St. Louis Cardinals as well, who was a fantastic hitter, certain first ballot Hall of Famer in a couple of years, but whose body really, broke down at times and robbed us of even more incredible feats that he would have performed. And I use him as a lens to look at how baseball players' bodies are sort of necessary instruments of their craft. I talk about the aforementioned Hub Pruitt in great depth and a lot of detail about his career that I don't think has been uncovered before. I talk about youth baseball, the experiences I had as an assistant coach for my son's baseball team right here in Peterborough, Ontario, the Peterborough Tigers. There's all kinds of stuff in there. It really, as I say, it really is the fruit of several years of research and just digging up fascinating stories and piling them all in there.
You talk about the punishment that a baseball season, again, 162 games, not counting spring training and, if you're lucky enough, playoffs, what kind of punishment that has on a human body. I'm assuming that you also touch on some of the pitchers, because back in the day, people would let pitchers' arms literally fall off before they got them out of the game.
Yeah, it's astonishing, the difference. And it's a complete revolution, the way that we think about sort of preserving pitchers' arms now. And another fascinating aspect of coaching youth baseball is the care with which those arms are treated and the very strict rules that exist now to make sure that players don't get hurt and try to pitch through it. But as you say, the norm for the majority of the time that people have played baseball is you throw until your arm hurts and then you keep throwing. And that, you put that together with the fact that, as you suggest, baseball seasons are absurdly long, almost comically long in the amount of playing that you're doing. As the great Earl Weaver, manager of the Baltimore Orioles, said, "This ain't football. We do this every day." It is a long, long season, and the wear and tear on the body is really something. And pitchers especially. You're right. They would be motivated to pitch until their arm fell off, because the moment they stop pitching, there would be somebody else to step into their job.
In putting this book together, did you have an opportunity to get in contact with some old-timers who are still around?
I did not. The closest I came to that was I had a lengthy conversation and correspondence with the player most in focus, Hub Pruitt. I spoke to his grandson several times, and he really helped me get into the sort of the genealogical research and pass down the family stories. But no, for the most part, these stories are born of research and a lifetime spent watching the game.
You've written about baseball in the past, and I'm just wondering, in putting this book together and doing your research, did you learn anything new that you weren't aware of when you were putting this book fieldwork together?
I think a lot of things, some very specific statistical things, some of the stories of these ball players that did crazy things off the field, like, wrestling alligators or getting law degrees and things like that. But I think most broadly, the thing that I come away with is an even greater appreciation for the degree to which baseball players then and now ought to be considered laborers and deserve the compensation that they're allowed as a result of it. I think I would have called myself a pro-labor guy before, but even more so now.
How would you consider the players that you're talking about in the book, those who have gone by, to the ones that are currently playing the game of baseball professionally?
I think there's no question, if you look at the old, the footage that we do have of ball players, grainy black and white footage going back 100 years or more, there's no question that they weren't the athletes that we have now, simply because, we've made so many advancements in things like nutrition and strength training and biometrics and all of the, the people that we have now, you look at a Giancarlo Stanton or an Aaron Judge of the Yankees, they're essentially superheroes. They wearing tight uniforms, they might as well be Marvel superheroes for the physiques that they carry around. And ball players in the past weren't like that. There's some exceptions. If you ever have an opportunity to see a photo of Jimmy Fox, who played in the 30s, his arms are astonishing. But for the most part, they were skinnier, less, well-defined, and they had bad teeth, and they just didn't have the advantages that modern players do. So I think that one of the interesting things about looking at baseball history is bearing that in mind when we talk about accomplishments that we're measuring today's players against and watching them exceed. It was a different game. It was a different world.
Well, when you look at one of the pictures of the greatest, one of the greatest players ever, Babe Ruth is not the picture of health.
He's not. And another difference that dovetails with what we're talking about is the fact that these players didn't have the off season to, have the 3 times a day sessions with a personal trainer. They were out working other jobs. So they couldn't afford to be dedicated to their own health 12 months a year.
It's a fascinating
and
book.
In Ruth's case, he probably had no interest in that.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fascinating book and a fascinating study at for lack of a better term, inside baseball, which makes you think about, as I said in the introduction, the rich history of the people who made the game the game. Andrew, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on the program with us.
My very great pleasure. Thank you for your interest.
Andrew Forbes, author of Fieldwork on Baseball and Making a Living. You can go to our website at thestuffile.com to the page for this show, which is show number 0820, and you'll find links to Andrew's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his book directly. You're listening to the Stuff File program with me, Peter Anthony Holder. And boys and girls, it's that moment you've all been waiting for. It's time now for the Idiot of the Day.
And now it's time for the strange things adults do. The Stuff File presents the Idiot of the Day.
Lucas Brown is now back in custody after he escaped the Pueblo County Detention Center in Colorado. Brown is the same inmate who previously pleaded guilty to an escape charge. According to Pueblo Sheriff David J. Lucero, the inmate was gone for about 35 minutes after walking out of the detention center. According to the sheriff's office, inmates designated as kitchen trustees were cleaning up for the night. Brown went to throw out the trash and took off running. Brown had worked in the kitchen since March 31st. So, for 24 days, he had been working and never had an issue. At the time of his alleged escape, Brown had just 2 days left in his sentence. The sheriff's office said he was originally sentenced to 90 days for criminal mischief. He now faces additional charges. Now, why? Oh, why? If you have just 2 days, 48 hours left in your sentence, would you stage a jailbreak? One reason, and one reason only. You're an idiot!
Gee, I'm only a kid, but even I know you're an idiot.
And that's it for this edition of the Stuff File program, number 0820. Hope you enjoyed it. The website is thestuffile.com, and once again, Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H, where you'll find information and links on all of our guests by going to the weekly Stuff File page. Just look for the corresponding program number, and once again, that's 0820. Email me at peter@thestufffile.com. You can also find me on Facebook, Spoutable, Mastodon, and Blue Sky as PA Holder. Check us out on patreon.com, where you can become a patron of the program. Hope to see you back here for our next show on the air, online, or as a download. We're coming to you from everywhere, including kdxradio.com, over the air on World FM in New Zealand, WLSL-LP FM in Dade City, Florida, KZZH-LP FM in Eureka, California, CKUW FM in Winnipeg, CFMU in Hamilton, CKLU in Sudbury, Local 107.3 FM in St. John, CHSR in Fredericton, and also streaming on just about any streaming service your little heart desires. That's it. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder, a presentation of Flying Fish Communications. Always remember this very timely piece of advice. Good news is just life's way of keeping you off balance.